of the Baltimore City Board of School Commissioners. It's our forum for the budget process for fiscal year 22. This evening we're going to have a presentation, and then we have time for public comment around the discussion of the budget process. And so, Courtney, I don't want to mess up your last name. Desabe?
Desabe, yep.
Desabe, I was getting close. Okay, thank you. And I'm going to turn it over to you for our presentation. Thanks so much.
Thank you. And thank you everyone for joining. I appreciate that this may be the last thing between you and non-work related events for your evening, so I will try to keep it concise. We're going to go through a presentation on the budget process for FY22, some of the things that are a little unique about this year and this process, and then also a little bit at the end on engagement. And then we're going to open up for any feedback or questions relating to the presentation or otherwise with regards to fiscal year 22. So a little bit of background. As we know, fiscal year 21, the year that we're in right now, is a little bit different from what we expected it to be. And just as a side note, I guess one of the cool things about working in budget or in finance is that you always kind of feel like you're living in the future. So correct me if I go off or I refer to the wrong year, or I refer to this year as FY22, which I'm prone to do as we go through the budget process. But fiscal year 21, the fiscal year that we're in right now, when we built this budget, it was not with the mindset of the coronavirus. We had gone through the budget development process, and we were just about to present the budget for vote when we closed down in March. The budget was already developed from the school's perspective. And what we ended up doing during the course of this year, after the year began, was making adjustments to the budget that we built based on the pandemic and based on the current landscape. We're trying with fiscal year 22's budget development, knowing what we know of the situation as it stands, to build a budget that is a little more thoughtful and considerate of the process or the changes in the process right now, at least those that we know of. We know the landscape is changing constantly. One of the things when we look at schools, as everyone is aware, there are currently some restrictions in schools in terms of spending. There are restrictions in terms of hiring. And making adjustments to the budgets up front can mitigate some of those necessities as we get into the fiscal year. We still don't know for fiscal year 22 what our revenue landscape will look like. We know very much what we hope for it to look like, which would be at least relatively similar to this year's revenue landscape, but that's not a given at this point. So there are a lot of things that are still up in the air. What we're going to talk through tonight are the stages of the budget development process, the 10 stages, which we'll kind of go through, specifically highlighting areas that involve community engagement, which we think is a very important part of the process and a part of the process that we would like to maintain even in our current environment, and then get into one of the new engagements that we're going to have with the board with regards to the budget this year. So in terms of the current landscape, like I said, we are all aware of the pandemic and we're all aware of what that means for schools. So schools can't spend as freely as they normally can. So a lot of the purchases that schools would normally make on their own, some of these are being made, on their behalf because of, buying power and availability and a number of other things like technology, for example. So we know that the landscape is a little bit different, and we're trying to bear that in mind as we go through the process. So in terms of the steps for budget development, their priority discussions, enrollment projections, school performance plans, the forums, collaboratives, budget reviews, approval, vote, staffing, and enrollment adjustments. I know I sped through those, but I'm going to spend a few minutes going through each one of those in a little bit more detail. So the first thing is the priority discussions, and we started this process. This will be our third year of developing the budget in this way. And this is based on feedback over years from the board and from community members. If you recall, 3 and 4 years ago when we were developing the budget, the community didn't have much opportunity for feedback until we got to around March or April when the budget's being presented, or when we're doing, some of the tours that we used to do going across the different schools and presenting a preliminary budget. At that point in time, as was very rightly pointed out, it's very difficult for anyone to give meaningful feedback into the budget process or into the priorities that are discussed at the district level. There was already a process in place, which I'll go into further down in the presentation for the school level engagement, but there wasn't a very robust process for district level engagement. How were the funds that were being held in district office allocated? So we went through this process to create more transparency and input into that. And for that to be done in a very genuine manner, and for it to take place as early as it does, it has to be sort of recognizing the variances or possible variances in funding, but not dependent on funding. A lot of our funding or revenue information we don't have fully available without, other than projections until the end of January. So it makes it difficult for us to have conversations about specific dollars before then. So we tailor the conversation, of course, with the idea of it being meaningful to take place around priorities. So even before we know what the dollars are or how dollars will be assigned or how much money we will get from the state or the city or how enrollment will impact revenue, we start the conversation on what is important to the community members. And we've shown in the last 2 years as we've gone through this process that we've been able to incorporate into the budget the items that the community members have given us feedback on. We utilize a process of online and in-person surveys and meetings, which usually in a normal year would be taking place right now. So they would start in November and take place in November and December. This year, we're shifting that process back a little bit. We're going to start the distribution or the advertisement for those soon, and the engagements will be taking place in December going into January. We're also very cognizant that there are a lot of other engagements that have been taking place and are continuing to take place. And one of the things that we're trying to work through with our assistance from our friends in the communications department is that presenting these conversations and discussions in a way that is still meaningful, still robust, still informative, still able to get significant feedback, but not burning out folks or overloading folks, knowing that they're engaging with us in a number of different ways about a number of different things. And even for, school level folks, and you'll mention this probably a couple of times as we go through the process, as we go through the timeline, that we're trying to be cognizant of all that school leaders have to deal with in terms of, running their school buildings and dealing with education this year in a particularly complex environment. And trying to lighten the load where possible on them in the budget development process, but still ensure that they feel fully supported. So a lot of these things at this point in time are being thought of or developed in a way where they could be both virtual as well as in person. I think one of the unexpected benefits that we've seen from some of our engagements, if a lot of you recall from prior engagements that we had, particularly budget engagements, attendance was not overflowing at a lot of these events. At one point in time, which I think worked to our betterment, we took the word like finance or budget out of the presentation. We just wouldn't necessarily acknowledge that we're coming to talk about money, even though we would, because I was convinced that that might have been a deterrent. We tried to make sure that the engagements were more accessible. And I think now that we have the capability and the accessibility to use an online platform, as we've seen with board meetings and a number of other engagements, we're seeing a lot more turnout for these events. So last year, the last 2 years, we had seen turnout increasing for budget-related events, and I would expect that to be even greater this year, using a more virtual and engaging platform for folks to be able to give voice to that. And even before the coronavirus, this was something that we had been discussing and working on with the communications department, using whether it's Facebook Live for interactive meetings relating to the budget and exploring different ways in which we could do that. So this year has really kind of pushed that to the forefront, made it more of a necessity than a wish or hope. And we hope to sort of leverage that to get even more feedback than we have in the past. And as I mentioned, so these priority discussions will be gathering input from the community on priorities that are being developed internally by the departments. So departments will be presenting priorities that are realistic. They're not going to put anything in front of community members that we cannot feasibly do. And also it's being very transparent with community members that just because something is asked for or voted on, it may not end up looking the same way that you expect, by which I mean we retain the discretion in terms of how we may combine things, how we may work things in. Yes, we know that this is a priority, but maybe there are restrictions in terms of how or over what period it may be applied based on funding, based on staffing, based on other factors taking place. So we want to be very honest about what the engagement looks like and also what it's going to be used for. And the past couple of years, we've shown in the budget presentation, these are the items that community, we went with a top 5 that community voted on. We presented to the board. Here exactly in the budget are how these things are implemented, and able to show that there's a transition between the feedback that we receive and also the final budget document that is sent out and approved on. The next item in the process is the enrollment projection. So this takes place simultaneously with the engagement process at the end of the year, December and January. This is more internal. This is where we're taking the data that we just received from the 9/30 enrollment, and we're building in projections in terms of how we think enrollment will look in schools, individual schools for fiscal year 22. So there are a lot of factors to take into consideration, not just, where kids are right now. We have to take into consideration things like the 21st century program, opening, closing of schools, transitioning or I guess combining of grades or grade configurations. We have to look at changes in neighborhoods. And very importantly, part of it too is looking at the growth or decline of population in the city. And even more importantly, getting feedback from people who know. So some of that is in central office. We have participation from planning department and operations. We have participation from Office of New Initiatives. We have participation from Office of Achievement and Accountability. We have participation from Enrollment Choice and Transfer. We have participation from a number of different areas, from people who work in areas that could affect or impact this data. And we also, very importantly, get feedback from school leaders. Anytime we develop projections, we send them out to principals to say, based on what you know of your community, based on what you know of your families, based on the outreach that you've done and programmatic changes and whatever else that you've done, tell us what you think about these numbers. Do you think they're realistic? Do you think they should be higher? Do you think they should be lower? Knowing that we use a weighted funding model, I will say a lot of the time, the responses are, of course they should be higher. I'm going to have way more kids than that. And we know that there are a finite, amount of kids, with which to draw from. And sometimes we have to reject specific responses. If there's no justification for why the numbers may change or need to be raised, we reserve the right, of course, to say, no, we just don't see where that change would be. And, sometimes we're right, sometimes we're wrong. There may be different occasions or situations that we might not be aware of that may factor into those things, which is why we ask the questions and then we have the discussions. So we finalize the projection numbers, also knowing that we go through the process, which is at the tail end of this, it'll be like, item number 10 or 9, where we adjust those enrollment numbers based on the actual enrollment in the fall. So we know that what we're doing in spring is a projection and it's what the budget is built on. It's what's voted on. It's what we load July 1st. But we also know that as students move in real life and in real time to different locations, we're going to rearrange the funding to match the movement of those students. The next item, which I'll mention quickly, is the school performance plans. And this is just important because we tie everything that school leaders do in terms of the budgeting process to what their goals are for their individual school. What are the metrics that they're using to build their budgets based off of? Is it that, we had a relatively weaker year in math scores than what we had anticipated or set our goals at, so we're making it a priority to invest in this? And then making sure that the investments and the discussions that follow are tailored towards meeting those goals. So that's why this is important to the process. And this is also, very significant in the spring as we go into the budget collaboratives and the community engagement part for schools. So as mentioned, school community budget forums is, and I don't, at the risk of sounding like I'm overstating this, I'm really very serious when I say one of the most important parts of the process. For us to have a fair student funding model and a model that's based on meeting student needs, a model that's based on equity, and a model that's based on all the things that we've said and we built it around in terms of the changes and adjustments that we've done, we have to have meaningful engagement and input from the communities around the specific schools. So we discussed earlier having input from the community around the district portion of spending. This is the beginning of the conversation for schools on their own priorities and their own discussions with their families on their budgets. So one of the changes, like I mentioned, we added a couple years ago was the priorities conversation. While we're doing the priorities conversation in central office for our budget, schools are also doing their priority conversations with their families. So they're talking before they have numbers. They're bringing them in and saying, this is what I'm thinking about. So step number 4 here in the process, the community budget forum, is when they have their numbers and they have their information in February, they have their allocation, or at least an idea close to what their allocation will be. They then go out and then engage their community members and say, well, here's what I have in my budget, or here's what I have in my allocation. And, I would like your input in building my budget. This is the plan that I have. This is the thought that I have. And then community members can give feedback on that. Now, as well, the principal being the unifying voice and the leader for their school building, they have ultimate say in terms of what they include in their budget, but they're fully expected to be transparent. And this is a part of the process that we have zoned in on over the last couple of years, particularly with the Family and Community Engagement Department, in terms of how do we ensure that these are being held with fidelity? How do we ensure that they're being held with as much, you want the variety to meet the environment, but you also want the fidelity that they're being held with a certain standard, that no one is experiencing it in a significantly different way from another. One of the things that has been done recently is that we've looked at the schools that have done this the best and try to model templates after those schools, looking at follow-ups and follow-throughs in terms of the documentations that the meetings are taking place, having people from central office attend some of these meetings to make sure these things are taking place, looking at feedback that is given from community members or staff or whoever that they didn't feel right about an engagement, they didn't think it was done with fidelity, or they thought it was rushed, or whatever the case is, and then going through the process with the school leader of building up their capacity to engage their community members and their families in a meaningful way as well. So it's something that we've zoned in on over the last, I want to say, 2 years, particularly. It was something that we had received feedback on, and we continue to fine-tune the process. Again, things will look different this year because of the current situation. A number of these things that I'm listing, these engagements, we expect that a number of them will be held in a virtual or semi-virtual format, meaning that there may be some in-person attendance under guidelines, or there may be some just online virtual attendance, depending on the discretion of the school leader. But we still expect the same criteria to be held in terms of monitoring attendance, keeping track of the materials that are used, and all the rest of the things that have been set out by the Family and Community Engagement Office. Item number 5 is the budget collaboratives. This is something that, in conversations with other districts, they've always found interesting, and it's something that is fairly unique to us at city schools. Because we use a weighted funding model, the fair student funding model, and we allocate resources based on individual students. We're one of the few districts in Maryland, the only in Maryland, one of the few in the country who do it that specific way. And we found that because we are putting this extra demand on school leaders to build their budgets and to think, financially and not just through their educational lens, that we want to provide as much support as possible for the school leaders to engage in these tasks. We want to make sure that they never feel left alone with regards to the budget process. We want to make sure they're supported, and not just supported by us in finance, but supported by all the experts in the various areas and departments. So the budget collaboratives are a 2.5-week process. We bring every school in, or we used to physically bring every school in. This year, again, there's considerations for how we can build it out virtually, where we have meetings going on with human capital, with budget, with special education, with grants, Title I, with teaching and learning, with college and career readiness, with operations and custodians and everyone who oversee custodians, and everyone involved in the process, to make sure that when a principal is going through the process of building their budget, and we literally walk through the process with them, their budget analyst, is putting it into the budget tool and saying, okay, $100 goes here, $1,000 goes here, this position is added, this position is moved, whatever the case is. I need more of this, I need teachers for math as opposed to teachers for science. As we go through that entire process, the principal is being supported through that. Their ILEDs, their school managers are there. So they're not making these decisions in isolation. They're adhering to COMAR. They're getting support in terms of other ways, or creative ways that they can go about building their budgets, knowing that funding can be particularly tight for some schools, and that they may have to get really creative in terms of what supports can be offered. And that happens at the table as well. teaching and learning may say that, we may have, some materials or some program that we think might be a good idea for you, or that might help you bridge this gap. We might look at different ways that we can utilize funding. Hey, maybe you can fit this position because of the job description, the criteria. This actually qualifies to be under a grant as opposed to being general funded, therefore freeing up, allocated resources. So we look at that whole big picture. Everyone sits at the table. We have the discussions together, in conjunction with the school leader, again, so that they feel supported through the process and they're not ever working in isolation when it comes to building a budget. And they're coming to these collaboratives with their planning, the discussions that they've had with their community members in terms of what the feedback is that they want to see in their budgets. And we know that they're going to go through this and they could probably experience change. What they came in with as their initial plan may not be what they end up with, which is where we end up with the community budget reviews. So this is a step of the process where they say, I've done my collaboratives, I've submitted my budget, it's going through the approval process, and here's what the final product looks like. I know we wanted to do A, and here's A, it's in the budget. Or I know we wanted to do B, but because of COMAR regulations, because of other implications, I had to cut staff here, or I had to move, funding for this here to match these things. But they're giving the explanation to their community members and being transparent with them in terms of how their budgets end up being submitted for approval, how they may differ from what was requested or what they had initially planned. So again, just highlighting the various steps in the process where we have community engagement, where we focus on community engagement, but also making sure, and this is one of the most challenging aspects of it, that it is being done meaningfully, that it's not just checking the box. So these are some of the areas where we don't want to make shortcuts. We don't want to make it too much, I don't want to say easier. We want to make sure that the processes are in place, that this is happening with fidelity, that when we're getting feedback, and there'll always be, both positive and negative feedback, but as much as possible that we're reducing that negative feedback, that we're not getting people coming to us and saying, hey, this meeting never happened, or hey, I never heard from this. And granted, there's a responsibility on everyone involved. There's a responsibility on community members and family members to be engaged in the process. But the onus primarily lies on us as a district to make sure that, the information is available, that it's attractive, that it's shared in a way that can be disseminated and understood by the community members as well, and that it's being done authentically. Now we get into some of the, the nuts and bolts. The budget approval process is internal. The same folks who are at the table during the collaboratives, looking at the necessities in the budget and walking the schools through what can and cannot do, are also going through various approvals within their departments. They're looking to see that, the boxes are checked and everything's met off, and that these are done sequentially. There are changes that can be made or adjustments that can be made that may impact other departments. So say, for example, there's a position to be filled and the individual who should be put into that position does not have necessary qualifications, or there was some change that needed to be made, or an individual, can't do that job for whatever reason, and we may have to switch someone else. So there could be financial implications. There may be a trickle down effect in terms of the other positions and other dollars that are affected, or vice versa. Maybe it frees up more money and they can now add some other program or a contractual obligation that they might have wanted to add. So there's a sequence to the approval process to make sure that things are being done in a way that the final budget meets all of the necessary checks and balances, and that is submitted as part of the larger budget to the board for approval. Which takes us to the board budget vote. So this is where we present to the board the budgets that have been compiled by the district. So the school budgets, the central budgets, grants, and everything else into the final document of the budget book and the budget presentation. And then we engage with the board. We intentionally have a 2, or as in this coming year, a 3-week period between the initial presentation and the final vote, so that the board also has a chance to ask questions, to dig deeper. And we get a lot of valuable input and questions from the board during this process. Why does this look this way? What does this mean? I want to see this and I want to see that. And then we go through the process of digging out that information, knowing that there's a lot of different morsels of data in a budget, and not all of it is readily available or readily transparent, which is something that we're working on, as I'll get to later. And making sure that everyone sees what they want to see or knows what they want to know. Make sure that all the questions are answered so the board feels comfortable during the voting process, but also as we go through this process, the board is seeking feedback from the community as well in terms of the budget that's being presented. After the budget goes out in initial presentation, community members may see things that spark questions that they bring to the board, or they bring to us in finance, or they bring to central office. And we try to answer and address as many of these things as possible between the initial presentation and the vote. This takes us into the summer months, where once the budget has passed and it's gone through the various rounds of presentation to our boards, to city council, et cetera, the human capital, in conjunction with other areas and school leaders, go through the process of staffing based on the approved budget. We can't, there's a lot that we do that is contingent upon, the budget being approved and funding being approved for positions. Human capital has done a great job over the last few years of queuing up as much of that process as they can and getting a head start on staffing to increase the pool of candidates and the quality of candidates that we're able to receive. It's also something that we've been cognizant of in terms of the timing of the budget process. And one of the things that we buttress against for planning our budget calendar and timeline to make sure we're adjusting staffing as early as we can in the year. And the step 10, the last step here, is the enrollment adjustment. So this is the process that we're going through right now for fiscal year 21, where we're adjusting the allocations based on where students actually are. So we said that there were going to be 100 kids in school A. Turns out that there are 80 in school A, but there are 20 more in school B. So we take the funding for those 20 kids and it goes where the kids go. And we make those adjustments on a school by school basis. So while we know that that can be sometimes particularly challenging for schools, having an initial budget done and then making changes to the budget, it is one of the ways that we ensure the equity of the budget process by making sure that the money follows the specific kids and that schools and school locations aren't being funded as much as each individual student. So it's also a very important part of the process. So as I mentioned, we had some feedback from the board this past spring in the last budget. It began with us making a concerted attempt to adjust the way that we present information for the budget book. The budget book in prior years we found, and we had feedback on, was a little difficult to digest. We sort of had a template of the things that we filled in, and we just updated that on a regular basis. We tweaked some of that language and some of the cover pages and dialogue based on what's pertinent at any given point in time. This year, we actually rewrote the entire beginning of the budget book in terms of the narrative. And the goal was to make sure that the language was accessible and understandable. We wanted to make sure it was concise. We wanted to make sure that it was not too convoluted or too bloated, and that anyone would be able to pick up the budget book and understand the information being presented and gain some detail and knowledge out of that narrative. We understand the back end of the book is used more for reference. There are a lot of tables, there's a lot of data, but at least for the narrative section and the methodology section of the budget book, that those would be more easily digested by our community members. We did get feedback from community members, staff, and even some board members that we succeeded with that. But a large data set like a budget, which is immense, there's a lot of information in there. We have to be selective in terms of what we present, because we can't, present a budget book with everything. And even, what you might consider one piece of data can be disseminated or described in 15 different ways. And it just depends on the question that's being asked. In an ideal world, it would be, and with given time and resources, we would be able to do this in a much more interactive, searchable format. One of the things that we discussed with some of the board members in the spring, and we're going to be fulfilling as we work on this in the next few months, is that we want to engage with them on their feedback for how they would like to see the budget book information. We also plan to, through our community priority discussions, see if there's a way that we can engage some of our community members, if any of them do digest the budget book or use the budget book or reference the budget book. How can we also make that document more accessible to them? So to that end, we started a work group that we're going to be meeting bi-weekly to discuss the budget book. And I'll say this is far earlier in the process than it normally takes place. We don't really start working on the budget, actual physical document of the budget book, until about February. But we wanted to make sure we're thinking about it differently than we have before, and that we're incorporating the feedback specifically from the board that we received in the spring, and then looking to engage the board members as well. Andre from Communications is going to be reaching out to Christian to work on some dates with the board members who are interested, so we can kind of get their feedback in terms of the data that they would like to see and different ways in which we can present that data. We understand there are going to be some restrictions in terms of what we can do with the budget book because of time and space and et cetera. But we also have the avenue of the budget presentation, the final presentation that goes to the board, where we have more license for freedom and creativity in terms of how we present data and information. And we can also use that to supplement what we're going to do with the budget book. So we're looking forward to that engagement this year. We're sort of heartened that there was positive feedback on the tweak to the budget book for anyone who noticed. A lot of people probably didn't. But we're looking to make sure we're taking another step in that direction and making information understandable and available for not just our board members, but our community members and families as well. So this is the majority of me talking at you. Where we are right now in tonight's proceedings is I'm going to open up for feedback and questions. If there are questions specifically on the process, I'd be happy to answer. If you want to give any suggestions for the process or just for budgets in general or fiscal year 22, things that are concerns or issues or just comments with regards to the budget process, we'd be happy to hear those.
Thank you, Courtney. I'm going to open up first to board members. Are there any questions about the process presented? I'm going to have to ask Christian if you give me some help, because apparently my screen is frozen, so I'm not really seeing anyone. And so if your hand is raised, I'm having trouble seeing it. But if you have a question, go ahead and let us know.
No questions from board members. There is a question.
Okay.
A member of the community, she also signed up for public comment. So.
Okay, and if we don't have questions, I want to thank you. Did I hear someone?
Oh yes,
Okay.
This is Commissioner Brooks. So Courtney, thank you so much for the
Go
presentation.
ahead.
So I just really thinking about you talked about community engagement earlier, and I know the budget book has been about really trying to translate the information that we have there so that families can better understand sort of really what's going on at this high level. So in that process, or maybe it's new, could you talk to me a little bit about how we sort of make sure that the families who need it the most get this information? So whether those are our students, families with disabilities, and what does that look like for engaging those families, sort of our families who might speak different languages, and sort of really try to bring them into the engagement process so that they also know that they are a part of this, and so forth.
Thank you for that question. And that has been a particular focus, particularly with reaching different groups and targeting different groups. So when we started priority discussions and discussions, not just at the school level, but at the district level on priorities, we wanted to make sure that it was very focused. We had a number of engagements, and I know there's some board members and staff members who'd been there. I know Commissioner Chinia had attended a few, years ago. We would do maybe 7 or 8 meetings. We'd go around the different schools. We'd make sure they're geographically placed so we could have, access, and feedback from different areas in the community. And then you'd have far more staff present than community members, or, we'd end up basically having mobile board discussions, with the board members that attended, because a lot of the questions or a lot of people attending were internal. Or we'd have, some of the same very active, avid community members attending, the multiple meetings, and it might be the same content. So we didn't always feel that it was the best use of resources and everyone's time. So it was a specific focus to make sure that we diversified how we advertise, make sure we diversified also the target audience for each meeting. So like this past year, for example, which was in the evolution of this was my favorite way of doing it. We split the meetings, the 4 sessions. Well, first of all, we pared it down to just 4 sessions instead of 7 or 8. And we targeted the audience for each. So the first meeting last year was what for our support groups. We had PCAT, CCAC. We had a lot of other groups, specific interest groups related to education, who were directly invited to the meeting, and who were asked to advertise to their members to attend that first meeting. And so we had a very targeted approach in that meeting. The second meeting we had was a student-focused engagement, which was led by staff in the engagement office, part of the Youth Up Next initiative. So we had very specific activities based on that audience. It was more interactive, it was more upbeat, it was a much more energetic presenter than myself, a more youthful presenter than myself, someone that could engage with the audience and get their feedback, and someone that already had a rapport with the students who were being invited to the event. And again, it was being marketed and offered specifically to those students. Then we had a general engagement, which was, sort of like the traditional format where it's an open forum, anyone who wants can attend. And I will spoil this a little bit by saying that that was the least attended of all of them, which kind of shows, I guess the emphasis on targeting a specific audience was a lot more useful. Of all the engagements, the general audience one was just, we had, I think, about 7 or 8 individuals attend who, again, were not staff, whereas we had much higher attendance at the others. And then my favorite engagement was actually the multilingual engagement that we did, which the attendance was unlike anything we've ever had in any of our general budget discussion meetings. We had a lot of multilingual families. We had translators translating in, I think, 6 or 7 different languages. We had specific activities where we were working in work groups with the families and breaking up the translators into the groups. We had staff members working within the groups as well, taking feedback, and there was a general presentation and discussion and forum. And also, the process of gathering feedback, whether through our online forums or our in-person forums. And of all the engagements we had, like that one was just the most energetic and robust. We know how much our EL population has changed, but it wasn't just focused on that population or that population's growth. It was really diversified, and we got a lot of feedback for what was important to an area of our community or area of our families that normally we have not heard or given enough platform to. So it was really very heartening, and we had seen that a little bit in the prior year, and then this past year when we did it, it was even larger. So it has been a focus. I think one of the areas for growth, and this is something that we've discussed, is expanding on the concept of targeting, specific groups and getting feedback and marketing to specific groups in ways that appeal to them, but not making it too targeted in that we isolate other groups. So making sure we're getting feedback from other groups that just because we didn't name them as part of the marketing, that they don't feel that they can participate. So it's something that we're thinking towards, also acknowledging that all we did was, a very small, cross-section of our community, and that there are a lot of other people that we can tap into. So that's one of the areas of thinking that we want to grow in. And, specifically, if you have suggestions for that, it's something that we'd very much be interested in as well, Commissioner Brooks.
Great, thank you so much. I appreciate that. And yes, I'll definitely, when you reach out to Christian and set it up, I'd love to continue thinking through that with you.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. Any other board member? Okay, I'm going to then turn it over to Christian, because I know we do have some folks who signed up for public comment.
Yes, first we have Ms. Heather Heilman on the line representing AFSCME.
Well, hello, good afternoon. Again, my name is Heather Heilman. I'm an attorney, and I represent AFSCME Council 67 and Local 44. I also represent BTU along with Keith Zimmerman from time to time, so you may see me in that context, but I'm here tonight to speak on behalf of AFSCME. And so as you know, I suppose, AFSCME represents a bargaining unit that includes and is primarily, I guess, the largest jobs within that bargaining unit are custodians and food service workers. Also bus drivers are in that unit. They're some of the lowest paid employees in city schools. And, and I'm going to couch my comments with the assumption that I assume we're going to be back to mostly in-person learning by next fall, but that COVID is still going to be an issue. I know we're all hopeful about a vaccine, but since we don't know when it will be available or how well it will be distributed, I think that's probably a fair assumption. You all didn't talk about that, but yeah, as I said, that's my assumption. So you've got these employees who are really the lowest paid employees in the school system. Some of them start at under $15 an hour. And they are also members of the community. A lot of times they, you know, as you know, they live near the school where they work. And in this new world that we live in, they have all sorts of, they're going to have all sorts of new responsibilities at work. And they're also going to be much more at risk of exposure. So to start off with, I would say, I know we're going to be in bargaining soon. And I think it's important that there are significant raises for these employees, and that is included when you're thinking about your budget. And also particularly about the custodians. You know, in the world we're in now, cleaning is more important and it's going to be more intense than it used to be. So it used to be mostly custodians would come in the afternoons and clean, but now you've got to clean the classrooms in the morning before the students come in, several times during the day, almost constant cleaning of high contact areas, and then, you know, again, after classes are over. And I think it's important that work is given to bargaining unit employees and that it's not contracted out. And that's it. And again, I think that has to do with being with caring about the community, that these are community members who deserve not only, you know, a living wage and the benefits and protections that come with being in the bargaining unit. So I think that should be built into the budget. And also, you know, I was thinking about school bus drivers are tasked, I understand, with both, you know, making sure that students remain, you know, socially distanced on the bus and don't sit too close to each other and don't sit too close to the bus driver. But nevertheless, the driver also has to just drive the bus safely. And I think that's that can be a big ask. And I think there needs to be some discussion and some thought about how to help those drivers, whether it's putting extra staff on the buses, some kind of training to help them understand their responsibilities and how to carry those responsibilities out.
Ms. Holland, you're at
Yeah.
time. You can finish out your thoughts.
Okay. Well, then my other thing was just also, you know, protections for food service workers have to be included and thought about. You know, that the school system has a responsibility to meet and to work with AFSCME to make sure that happens. But just certainly I want to make sure that those sorts of protections and those sorts of and the proper wages for these employees are included as you're formulating the budget. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Next, we have Ms. Keisha Goodwin. Are you online?
Christian, Christian?
Yes.
Okay, I'm sorry. This is Commissioner Richardson. Is this an opportunity to ask questions, or are we listening to public comment here?
I believe it's an opportunity to ask follow-up questions.
I just had a question for, before we go to Ms. Goodwin, I did have a question for our last speaker. I just wanted to know, has she and her unit been involved in any of the budget conversations thus far?
I'll be honest, this is the first time that I've known of the opportunity to be involved. It may be that the union knew of opportunities that it didn't share with me. So,
okay.
But if you
that's
want to
good.
include me on mailing list, that would be helpful.
Yeah, that's just helpful for us to know. And I'm sure Courtenay will document that because we really do want this process to be all inclusive. So thank you. Thank you for that.
All right, thanks, sure.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Goodwin, I see you on, if you're on your phone, try *6 if you're not on the app, and that should unmute you. I just saw you on mute, so try it again. Okay, I see you as unmuted. Ms. Goodwin?
Hello?
Yes, we can hear you. You have 3 minutes.
Okay, thank you. All right, good evening, CEO, Chair, and Commissioners. I hope all is well. This evening, I'm speaking to reiterate a priority and value of the Every Student Succeed Act, ESSA. But this has not been a budget priority of BCPSS for our traditional schools. According to ESSA, districts are responsible for recruiting and retaining highly effective and experienced educators, staff, in high-need schools. And effective and experienced staff is one of the education resource equity topics that requires adequate distribution of funds from the Fair Student Funding Formula, FSF. A progressive baseline with progressive weights will assist with this pursuit. However, BCPSS has implemented a regressive Fair Student Funding budget, such as decreasing baseline funding from $5,590 to $5,564, also changing weights from 800 to 400, and decreasing the student risk amount to 525. Not to mention, they do not allow the baseline funding for SPED students like they do in charter schools. Due to these budget cuts, our highly effective and experienced staff are surplus and replaced eventually by temps and contractors in pursuit to free money for other resources. I wonder, has the school board realized that robbing Peter to pay Paul has had a negative impact on student outcomes? These impacts include, but not limited to, persistent achievement gap, the mediocre graduation rate that only increased due to a retention policy change, the mediocre percentage of 13% of students being able to read on the 10th grade level and able to pass Algebra 1, and CTE students failing to make a living wage within 5 years of graduating from high school. Therefore, the Fair Student Funding pilot is a disaster. I recommend a progressive Fair Student Funding, prioritizing recruiting and retaining effective and experienced educators / staff in high-need schools, and also holding schools harmless of enrollment decrease, the same sentiment that you are asking from the state. This pretty much concludes my statement for budget priorities, because I've heard during your legislative meetings that you are prioritizing internet and positive school climate environment. Are there any questions or thoughts?
Are there any board members who would like to have any follow-ups for Ms. Goodwin? Okay. Okay. Thank you, Ms. Goodwin. I think we got what you said, and we consider this.
All right, thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Ms. Goodwin. And Chair Chinya, that was the end of public comment, so back to you.
Okay, well then I want to thank those folks who have joined us this evening. I hope if you get an opportunity, because I know this we do record these meetings, the description of the process was excellent, and I suggest that you either review that presentation, the slides, or actually watch it again in terms of what we will be doing, the 10 steps that we go through in terms of this process for budget development. And hopefully you've heard we're not perfect yet, but we are working very, very diligently towards being more open, more transparent, and having meaningful public participation and comment and input and feedback into this process of building the budget, both the district level budget as well as the school level budgets. And so I encourage everyone, if you're connected to a school, or be certain to look for those dates when I know some schools have already started asking parents about priorities. You can continue with us as we look at the district priorities, but please stay involved with us as we go through this process. And so with that, I'm going to say thank you. Everyone, please have a very safe, and this meeting will be adjourned. And thank you so much for joining. Because there's another comment. Okay, then good night, and we will see you at our next meeting. Thank you.
Good night.